If you've ever walked through Oakwood Cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas, you may not realize that beneath these quiet grounds rest several of the most notorious figures of the Old West. Among them are James B. Miller, better known as Killer Miller or Deacon Jim. Luke Short is here too, and also Timothy Isaiah Longhair Jim Courtright. But of these three men, none carried a darker reputation than Killer Miller. Yet he looked nothing like the cold-blooded assassin people described. He dressed impeccably, spoke politely, rarely gambled. He neither drank nor smoked, and regularly attended the Methodist Church, earning him the unlikely nickname of Deacon Jim. But beneath that respectable appearance was one of the most feared hired killers of the Old West. Miller preferred a shotgun, often attacking his victims from concealment before disappearing into the darkness. He shot him in the back. He was suspected of numerous killings and was known to accept money to eliminate another man. Yet, time after time, witnesses disappeared, juries failed to convict, or charges simply fell apart. He also carried a secret beneath the long black frock coat he wore in almost every kind of weather. A custom-made, heavy steel breastplate rested against his skin, designed to stop bullets. During a violent feud with Pecos Sheriff George Bud Frazier, Miller was shot repeatedly in the chest. Frazier believed the gunfire should have killed him, but the bullets had struck the steel plate hidden beneath Miller's coat. Miller survived. The feud continued until September of 1896, when Miller found Frazier inside a saloon in Toyah, Texas. Opening the swinging doors, Miller fired his shotgun at Frazier, killing him. Once again, Miller was brought to trial, and once again, he walked free. By 1900, Miller and his family had moved to Fort Worth. From here, his reputation as a professional assassin continued to grow. He was said to accept contracts for murder, sometimes charging hundreds or even thousands of dollars for killing. Among the deaths attributed to him was that of attorney James Jarrett, who was ambushed near his home in 1902. In 1906, Miller was accused of murdering a policeman and former Deputy United States Marshal Ben Collins outside Collins's home. Miller was arrested, but again, he was never convicted. Alan Augustus Gus Bobbitt was a respected rancher and former Deputy United States Marshal. Jesse West and Joe Allen were accused of arranging Bobbitt's murder, with Barry B. Burrell acting as the go-between. The price reportedly offered for Bobbitt's life was $1,700, roughly the equivalent of $60,000 today. On February 27, 1909, Miller concealed himself near Bobbitt's ranch and waited. As Bobbitt returned from Ada in a wagon, Miller fired both barrels of his shotgun from an ambush. Bobbitt was gravely wounded and died soon afterward. Miller fled back toward Texas, but investigators connected him to the killing. He was arrested and returned to Ada to stand trial alongside Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry Burrell. Many residents feared the four men would escape conviction. During the early morning hours of April 19, 1909, an armed mob entered the Ada jail and seized the prisoners. The men were taken to a nearby livery stable for private justice. This was not a lawful execution. There was no verdict, no sentence, and no opportunity for an appeal. It was a lynching. As the others reportedly pleaded for their lives, Miller remained calm. He asked that his diamond ring be returned to his wife and requested permission to die wearing his black Stetson hat. That request was granted. Standing beneath the rope, with an ice-cold gaze, Miller reportedly gave his final command.
"Let it rip,"
he said. His headstone bears no mention of the violence, the accusations, or the men whose deaths were connected to his name. It simply reads, husband. Our next gunfighter buried here is Luke L. Short. He was a gambler, saloon owner, and gunfighter whose refined appearance concealed just how dangerous he could be. With his tailored suits, silk top hat, and walking cane, Short carried himself more like a wealthy gentleman than a man who had survived violent encounters and had taken lives himself in some of the most brutal towns of the Old West. Born in 1854, Luke Short spent much of his youth in Texas. As a young man, he worked as a cowboy before becoming a civilian scout and a dispatch writer for the United States Army. But Short eventually discovered that his future would not be made with either occupation. He traveled through the boomtowns of the Old West, building a reputation as a skilled gambler and exceptionally fast gun. Although his elegant appearance earned him a reputation as a dandy, those who knew him understood that Luke Short was not a man to be underestimated. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches tall, Short's polished and self-possessed manner may have caused some men to mistake refinement for weakness. In 1881, while working at the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona, Short encountered another gunfighter named Charlie Storms. According to contemporary reports, Storms had been drinking when he grabbed Short by the ear with one hand while holding a pistol in the other. It was more than an argument. It was a deliberate public humiliation, as though Short were a child who could be easily manhandled. But Storms had judged him entirely by his size and appearance, and that mistake would prove fatal. Short drew his own weapon and fired. Storms was struck 3 times and died from his wounds. A coroner's jury determined that Short had acted in self-defense, and he was released. It would not be the last time Luke Short walked away from a deadly gunfight. Short later became part owner of the famous Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City, Kansas. When local authorities attempted to force him and several other gamblers out of town, Short called upon some very powerful friends. Among those at his side were Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, but Short's influence extended well beyond his fellow gunfighters. He appealed directly to Kansas Governor George Glick, while additional pressure reportedly came from the powerful Santa Fe Railroad, which had substantial business interests in Dodge City. Luke Short possessed far more than skill with a gun. He had loyal friendships, money, business standing, and the influence to bring high-ranking, prominent people to his defense when he needed them. Their efforts became known as the Dodge City War. Although many feared that bloodshed was inevitable, the conflict was ultimately resolved without violence. The gathering also produced one of the most famous photographs in Western history, the Dodge City Peace Commission. Luke eventually sold his interest in the Long Branch and made his way to Fort Worth, Texas. In 1884, Short and his business partners took control of the White Elephant Saloon, one of the grandest and most celebrated establishments in the state. The original White Elephant stood on Main Street in the heart of Fort Worth. Behind its doors was a 40-foot mahogany bar with an onyx surface. Elegant dining rooms, billiard tables, and gambling rooms reached by a broad carpeted staircase. It was a gathering place for wealthy cattlemen, professional gamblers, and some of the most recognizable figures of the Old West. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Bat Masterson, and former Fort Worth Marshal Jim Courtright were all known to have passed through its doors. Luke Short maintained an office inside the White Elephant and supervised its gambling rooms. In February 1887, his instincts as an experienced gunfighter would be tested once again. Former City Marshal Jim Courtright was then operating a private detective agency in Fort Worth. According to the most widely repeated account, Courtright offered local gambling houses and saloons his protection in exchange for a portion of their profits. Luke refused to pay, making it clear that he did not require his services and could provide his own protection. Tension between the two men continued to grow until the night of February 8, 1887, when Courtright arrived at the White Elephant carrying 2 pistols and called for Luke to come outside. Jake Johnson, a friend and business associate of both men, attempted to calm the situation. Luke agreed to speak with Courtright, and the two began walking along Main Street. The confrontation that began at the White Elephant would end only a distance away near Ella Blackwell's shooting gallery. Timothy Isaiah Courtright, better known throughout the Old West as Longhair Jim, was a Civil War veteran, former Army scout, and one of Fort Worth's most respected and feared lawmen. He had served 3 terms as city marshal during the violent years when Hell's Half Acre was filled with saloons, gambling houses, brothels, and dangerous men from across the country. But many describe Jim Courtright as a bully and a brawler who increasingly operated on both sides of the law. By 1887, Courtright had encountered one man who could not be intimidated. On the night of February 8th, Luke Short and Jim Courtright stood facing one another only a few feet apart. Exactly what was said between them remains uncertain. According to Luke's account, Courtright accused him of carrying a gun. Luke denied that he was armed, although a pistol was concealed beneath his clothing. Courtright warned him,
"Don't you pull a gun on me."
Then Courtright reached for one of his own pistols. Jim Courtright may have been considered one of the fastest guns in Texas, but on that night, Luke Short was faster. The first bullet struck Courtright's gun hand, tearing away part of his thumb and preventing him from firing. He attempted to transfer the pistol to his other hand in a maneuver sometimes called the border shift, but according to eyewitness accounts, the weapon became caught on his watch chain. He never completed the move. Luke rapidly fired off several more bullets, striking Courtright in the shoulder and chest. Courtright fell backward near the entrance to the shooting gallery. The entire confrontation was over within seconds. Luke was immediately taken into custody. As Courtright's friends and supporters gathered nearby, there were fears that Luke might be dragged from the jail and lynched. But Bat Masterson remained close to his friend throughout the night, armed with a shotgun and prepared to protect him if necessary. Investigators ultimately determined that Courtright had reached for his weapon first. Luke was never brought to trial for the killing, and the shooting was accepted as an act of self-defense. Luke Short lived for another 6 years, despite surviving numerous violent encounters. It was illness, not another gunfight, that finally ended his life. He died in 1893 at the age of 39. Interestingly, Luke Short and Jim Long-haired Courtright, the two men who faced each other in that fatal gunfight on that fateful day, are not far from one another here at Oakwood Cemetery.